Is my big chain ring too small? Is that the problem? Is it teeny tiny and it's making life miserable for me? Well, we're going to talk about that on this Tech Tuesday video because recently I made some changes. Now, recently I did the Climb to Kaiser ride, which was the hardest ride I think I've ever done in one day, probably up to this point at least. And that was a big day. That was 154 miles, 15,000 plus feet of climbing up into elevation. And most of that climbing was all in the first half of the ride. So it was a challenging day. And I wanted to assess the gearing on my Time 80HX. It's running a 2x SRAM access setup. And I thought, I sure would like to give myself a bit of an edge for that day, and that meant lowering my gearing, which I did. But the question was, would that mess up my riding for the rest of the time that I ride this bike here at home? So let's talk about 2x, what I changed, how it's worked out, and the thought that maybe your chain rings might be too big. Now to begin with, let's set some ground rules, shall we, on gearing. 3 categories. First one is conditions. Where you ride, what it's like where you live. Is it really hilly, really mountainous? Is it flat? Is it Florida or the Front Range of Colorado? Because that is going to have a big determining factor on how your gearing needs to be set up. And the second thing is confidence. In other words, who are you? Are you a beast? Can you just push really, really big gears and you can climb without having a low gear? Or you just live for the high-speed flats? If you're that type of person, then that gearing that you could use may not make very much sense for me. So we need to consider who you are. And then there's preferences, isn't there? Some things you just may like. You may like riding an 8-speed freewheel with a triple crank on the front, and you're happy with that, and that works for you. And if that's the case, that's really, really good. So you need to take all 3 of those into considerations when you're thinking what gearing makes the most sense for me. Now, I've been spending a lot of time lately on 1x, haven't I? In the gearing series. This is the part 3 of this gearing series. Part 2, where I was talking about trying to get out of that gap that I noticed in my SRAM Eagle cassette using the mullet for the gravel bike. And so I've been spending a lot of time on 1x. But today, it's really all about 2x, because as far as I'm concerned, 2x, that is still king of the road. Why is that? On the road, we really, really care about being efficient. On the gravel bike, we care some, but a little less. On the mountain bike, between the rocks, the roots and the rocks and all that, efficiency is much less important as surviving. But on the road, you're just on fairly smooth tarmac. You're turning the cranks over hundreds of thousands of times. You're in the wind at speed. And so efficiency really, really matters. Hence, all the aero focus lately on road bikes. So we do need to keep in the mind that efficiency is really, really important on the road, which 2x in general is more efficient on the road than 1x. Why is that? Well, chain line is one thing. On a 2x crank, obviously, your chain moves over. And so if you're in the bottom half of the cassette, on the faster part of the ride, you're going to spend hours there. And with a 1x, your chain line is always going to be at more of an angle than you're going to be with a 2x crank in the big ring. And so that matters as well. 2x still gives you a very, very wide range while maintaining a small cassette stack, if you will. So instead of having to go with a 1044 like in SRAM Explorer with a 1x and still really not have all the gears you might need for the road, right? On this bike, well, I've got a 1036 cassette, and with the cranks I've been running on it, that's all the gearing I need. So there's less gaps in the cassette, all the gears are closer, and that feels better generally when you're caring about cadence on the road, which is more important there than probably any other place. So 2x, still the boss as far as I'm concerned on the road. Now I may do a 1x road bike at some point, maybe if I was doing some kind of travel all-road build, but generally speaking, I can't imagine ever getting off of 2x, not for my road bikes. Now, when I built up the Time 80HX, obviously I'm using the SRAM access stuff. I have three crank options without going to something super special, trying to find some pro level red chainring or setup or something, which didn't interest me. Now I built it up with a 4835 front crank and like I said, the 1036 cassette. And that worked really fine for here. That was equivalent enough to me to my, so a 5030 a 50-34 front crank like on a Shimano Compact with, say, an 11-34 cassette, okay? Pretty equivalent. In fact, I think a 4810 is probably a taller gear than a 5011. But since, in my experience, I've only spun a 5011 out a couple of times, and I don't really expect to continue to do that very often, I really wasn't concerned about a 4810 being a tall enough gear. And a 35-36, that's a little deeper than 1-to-1, and it worked really good for my riding in my general area. But I was getting ready to do that big ride, that climb to Kaiser with 154 miles and 15,000 feet of climbing to elevation, etc., etc. And I thought, man, I would like to have a little bit lower gear. I want to be able to keep my heart rate down. I want to manage that. I want to spin as much as I can so I don't crush myself in the first half of the ride and, you know, tap out because I did too much too soon. So I had a couple options. I can't change the rear cassette, 1036, it's as tall as it gets without doing something wacky and crazy and beyond my derailleur capacity. I didn't really want to do that. But SRAM gives us some really nice options and cranks. Now, 4835 was what I have. There's a 4633, right? And there is also a 4330 SRAM access. Now that crank, the 4330, that's a wide access. It's access wide. Needs a different front derailleur, it means different chain line. It's really a gravel group and it's spaced differently to make room for, I think, bigger, fatter tires in a gravel bike so your chain isn't in the way. And I thought about that. I thought, well, a 4330 would be pretty nice for that kind of climbing day. But then I thought, well, it needs a new front derailleur. And honestly, I was curious. I was curious about something. I was wondering, can I reduce my chainring size a little bit and live with it full time? And so I went with that. I went with the 4633 crank. Now, 3336 was a low enough gear to have me be able to spin 10% grades over extended time. I'm over the top of the crank pretty easily, and that was really what I was going for. But here was the question, would a 46 front chainring be big enough? Because it's not all mountains, and sometimes I'm on the flats in the group, and I didn't want to be running out of gear. And so this has been my experience so far with this. And let's look at how it's been, the pros, and if there are any cons, what are they? Now, what I don't have to offer, I don't have that. Remember when I did the mullet gap cassette video, this number 2 in this gearing series, this is number 3 in the gearing series. I plugged it all into the Access app and it showed me where I was and what gear for how long. Well, unfortunately, I've already done all this before I found how to use that app really well. So I don't have the numbers and I'm not going to go back and put the other crank on and mess with it. So what I had been doing basically was riding along at my normal pace. Let's say my normal pace on a flat road, just me out for 40 miles would be maybe 18, 19 miles an hour, okay, just to say. And I would look and I'd say, what's my chain line right now? I'm in the big ring. Where am I on the cassette? And if I was in a 46, would I be like in the 10 already? And I thought, no, I don't think I would be. It's probably going to be about a 1 cog difference, right? Probably about 1 cog, one either way, depending upon the front crank. And so when I changed it, what I found was, yeah, that was about right. And I have been spending good quality time in the bottom half of the cassette. And so far, I haven't been in the 10 very often at all. And yet, I have yet to spin out this 46 tooth front chainring. Will that happen someday? Yes, probably. But even with the group rides back home and general riding, there are times I'm in the 10, but I'm not spun out and I'm pedaling at the low 30 miles an hour, 31, 32, probably 35 I can still spin fairly well, though it's getting a little bit, crazy hamster at that point maybe, but I can still do it. And honestly, there's not too many times I'm going to care about pedaling faster than 35 miles an hour. So far, that's been a pro. I have not ran out of big gear, so to speak. Now, I'm kind of a diesel. I've said that before. And I'm getting less of that as I'm older because I need to spin more just for my heart rate and my strength and whatnot. But I still like to just kind of get into a bigger gears and stay there. I like to stand and climb as well. Instead of shifting into the small ring, I'll shift up a couple gears and just get out of the saddle in the big ring and go over the top of the hill. That works good for me. Now, with a smaller front, big chain ring, you can stay in it longer because you are forced to move up the cassette at a slower pace. If I make a big chainring on there at any given speed, I need to be further up on the cassette, don't I, in order to maintain that same speed, because I need a lower gear in back to make up for the bigger gear in front. With the 46, well, I can stay in the big ring for a long time. Now, I don't run fully crossed over. I'm not going to do that. But I'll go up into 3 cogs down and stay there for a while and just push the big gear for, you know, up over the rise of the hill or whatever. And it actually works really well for me. And so for me, I can stay in the big ring longer. And that is a plus. Are there any cons? Well, so far there really haven't been too many cons. I would say, though, if I had to guess, it's less efficient in the way that smaller chain rings typically are considered to be less efficient. There's more friction, there's more pressure of your chain on a smaller situation, kind of like you feel when you're in the 10-tooth cog and you're taking that chain really quickly over a really small area. I'm sure that a 46 tooth is less efficient than a 50. Am I really going to notice that? I don't know, and I don't have a power meter. I can't measure it. And I think it's unrealistic for me to worry about that a whole lot. But you know, when you see like the time trial guys and whatnot, and on the track, etc., they're running really, really big front chain rings, and that isn't for no reason at all. That's because they are looking to get the tiniest bit of watt savings. And for guys like you and me, I think that is much, much less important. But yes, I'm sure at some point, some level, the 46 tooth front chain ring is less efficient than a 48 or a 50 or a 52. And that's really the only con I can think of. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look as impressive at the coffee shop as a big old 52 tooth Dura-Ace crank sitting on there, and people go, "Whoa, you're a bad mamma jamma, look at that guy or gal." But other than that, all right, is there a moral to this story besides the fact that granny gear, you're getting older and your chain rings are getting smaller? Well, I guess there kind of is. For one thing, a couple morals maybe. One is, you do you. You be free to experiment with different gearing that makes sense for you. Crank lengths, right? Crank lengths are all the rage right now. People are finding that, hey, you know, shorter crank lengths work better for a lot of people. You got bad knees, you have mobility issues, try a shorter crank. But smaller chain rings too. Man, so far, lower gearing for me has been a movement that I don't think is going to stop anytime soon. I'm getting older. I can't sit and just push those big gears up the hill like I used to. So I need to do gearing that makes sense for me. And thanks to SRAM and other people out there that are giving us gearing options, I have the option to change my gearing and go to something that makes sense for me. But if someone comes along and tells you, man, you don't need gears that low, you know what? Who are they to tell you what is best for you? You figure out what's best for you, and if that is bar end shifters and a triple crank and an 8-speed cassette, well, more power to you, my friend. You go ride your bike and enjoy it. You guys have a great week and or weekend, and as always, like I said, go ride your bikes with whatever gearing makes sense for you.